My memory is Yavamis.
No, I mean this.
Yeah,
Memra,
me-
an opinion.
opinion.
They don't have this stuff in the, I think in the Bavli.
Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Shvi'is Perek Yud Halacha Aleph. We are starting the 10th and the final chapter of Shvi'is, and we are moving into the mitzvah of Shemitah. You see, until now we have been using, at least in most, the word Shvi'is, which means the seventh year. The word Shemitah means to relinquish, to let go of. And the word Shemitah, and the reason why some people actually call the whole year Shemitah, that's because we have in the Torah one positive commandment and really two negative commandments connected to the mitzvah of Shemitah. And that is if a person loaned money, and underline the word loan. So someone owes money, the borrower owes money because of a choiv, because of a debt, right? This is important because there are many other reasons why one will owe money. Those other reasons are b'chlal not affected by the year of Shvi'is. The mitzvah of Shemitah is a mitzvah to relinquish a loan. And actually, just reading quickly the pasuk in Parshas Re'ei, the Torah says that Miketz Sheva Shanim, that at the end of the seventh year, Tasa Shemitah. Now, when you read the pasuk at the end of the seventh year, make Shemitah. Shemitah means relinquish loans. As the Torah, we're going to read the pasuk in a moment. I want just to quickly review that you have, let's call it the opinion of the Rambam, and really almost all with the Rambam, that the obligation and the relinquishment of the loan happens at the end of the seventh year. Miketz Sheva Shanim. I'm going to jump right away into something that we are all familiar with, which is the making of a pruzbul, which is really a declaration of a pruzbul that we do when we do Hataras Nadarim, that most people only do it at the end of the seventh year, because it says, Miketz Sheva Shanim, at the end of the seventh year, make Tasa Shemitah. The Rosh and the Alter Rebbe, L'chumra, also paskins like the Rosh, says that Shemitah has two parts to it. Number one is that the lender is not allowed to collect. In other words, it's not that the loan goes away. The lender is not allowed to collect. From when does that happen? From the end of the sixth year. And then there is another step according to the Rosh, which is that aside of the fact that he may not collect, the loan itself becomes, so to say, nullified. That happens at the end of the seventh year. Accordingly, we do today, we Lubavitch and those who follow the Alter Rebbe, we articulate the pruzbul both at the end of the sixth year, which means Erev Rosh Hashanah of the seventh year, and at the end of the seventh year, which is Erev Rosh Hashanah of the eighth year. Now, I'm going to continue to read in the pasuk. Says the Torah, this is in Parshas Re'ei. V'zed dvar hashmita. This is the matter of Shemitah. This is the matter of relinquishment. Shamoit kol ba'al mashe yodoi. Every creditor shall relinquish that which he has claim over his fellow. Asher yasher b're'eyu. That's a positive commandment, to let go. And then the Torah gives a negative commandment, a love, and that is lo yigois esre'eyu ve'es achiv. He shall not press his fellow or his brother for payment. So both you have to relinquish and you cannot press. In addition to this asay and this lav, in addition to that, there is another lav connected to the mitzvah of Shemitah, which is also in Parshas Re'ei, when the Torah says, Yishamar lecha, take heed, pen yeh davar im levavcha b'li'al, that you might have an evil thought that will enter your mind, which is to say to yourself that since since the seventh year, which is also the year of relinquishment, is approaching, and therefore I won't lend money. And that's not something you are allowed to do. It's amazing. So we cannot, it's allowed. I cannot not lend money before the seventh year, And concerning the 7th year, again, whether Miketz is at the end of the 6th or Miketz the end of the 7th, Shamoit, relinquish, and Lo Yigois, do not press, but both the relinquishment and the not pressing is about payment for a loan. Just quickly, one final important machlokes rishonim. The Mordechai holds that the relinquishment of the loan happens automatically, or it happens by God Almighty, and his words are that it's afkata de malka. It's something that the king, which is God, lets the loans go, and the Yereim actually is of the opinion that the lender has to declare that the loan is nullified. So there is an obligation on the lender to nullify the loan. It's called afkata de gavra, but without that declaration, then the loan is not relinquished. Let's leave that enough for the introduction. Now, what our Mishnah, Daf Ayin Tes, today's Daf is Daf Ayin Tes, will do, it's going to introduce the law of relinquishment, and it's going to make a point by saying that it's only regarding a debt that's resulting from a loan, only that is canceled, or that has to be relinquished. But there are many other type of debts that don't originate from a loan that are not going to be relinquished. That will be basically the bulk of the Mishnah. And not only that, even debts that come from a loan at times will also not be relinquished. Just as an example, that if the lender took collateral, took a mashkin, that loan is not going to be relinquished. Why? Because what needs to be relinquished? A debt that's in the hand of the debtor. But when the lender takes collateral, even though he doesn't want to keep the collateral, he wants to get paid. But if he won't get paid, he already collected the collateral. The collateral is already in his hand. So it's not don't approach your fellow. He doesn't have to approach his fellow. His fellow wants to redeem the collateral, for example. So that is not going to be relinquished. Even though the borrower is going to pay money and he's going to get his mashkin back, that's going to be permitted. On the other hand, now think about this, because that will be the bulk of the Gemara of today's daf. What happens if a person documents the debt of a loan? Ishtar. And we have a rule that we're going to review. We had this in Masechtas Bava Metzia. Let's go not with Rabbi Meir, with the opinion of the Chachamim, that achrayis is ta'u sofer, which means whether they wrote explicitly in the document that the land of the borrower is liened or not, a documented loan automatically places a lien on all of the real estate of the borrower. Now, is that considered like a mashkin? You would think that's like a mashkin, because here again, land is not going anywhere. The land is where it is. The lender has a document which will give him the right to the land if the borrower is going to default. You would think that lending with a document should be like lending with collateral. That not. No, that even if the loan was documented, it's not considered as if the lender already collected the debt. That's what the Mishnah says. And in the Gemara, we're going to have 3 explanations as to why not, as to what's the difference between a mashkin and a loan that was documented bishtar, especially if we're going to go with the shita that achrayis is ta'u sofer, which means that all debts that are documented automatically place a lien on the real estate of the borrower. And that's going to lead us into 2 different types of liens. And first of all, there is a general lien. There are 3 types of liens. A documented loan is liened. I'll say if I'm the borrower, my real estate, if I own real estate, is, so to say, guaranteeing the debt. Now, there is a further type of lien in which the lender and the borrower are miyached karka. They specify which land is going to be used if the debt won't be repaid. That is also known as a apoitike. That's in Aramaic. Apoi tehei koi. Here is where you're going to stand. That's when you designate a property. Even in an apoitike, let's see how far we'll get today, there are 2 types of apoitikes. That's something that I don't remember learning in the Bavli, at least not in these words. You have a apoitike mefurash, and you have an apoitike stam. We'll see what that means, and we'll see how that's relevant, hugely relevant to the topic of our new Pedic. One final word of introduction that I should have said before. unlike the dinim of shvi'is, of the land resting, which are dinim that are only applicable in the Holy Land, certainly midoiraisa, even though we learned that certain adjacent lands to Israel are included in the dinim of shvi'is midrabanan. But shvi'is, the resting of the land, is a din connected to the Holy Land. The din of shmitas ksafim, the din of shmita, relinquishment of loans, has nothing to do as to where you're living, has nothing to do with where the loan was made. It's equally biblically bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz. But when is there a biblical obligation of relinquishing loans? Only when during Yovel you have to also relinquish the ownership of lands, allowing the lands to return to their original owners. That's called Shmitas Karkois. And whenever that is not in effect, because Yovel is not in effect, because you don't have the Kol Yoshveh Oleh or the Roiv Yoshveh Oleh, then Midoiraisa, there's no din of Shmitas Ksafim, even though Midrabanan there is. In other words, nowadays you have Shmitas Ksafim Midrabanan because the Chachamim said we don't connect the din of Yovel and the din of Shemitah. But whenever Yovel will return, the din of Shemitah won't only be biblical in the Holy Land, it's going to be biblical in the entire world. Okay. Says the Holy Mishnah, Daf Ayin Tes, Hashvi'is mishametes es hamilva. That Shvi'is relinquishes the loan. Again, I don't want to use the word canceled because we already mentioned that according to the Rosh, and we follow the Alter Rebbe's psak, like also the Rosh, that really there's two steps to it. And in the beginning of the 7th year, even though the loan is not canceled, but there's already a lav for the lender to collect, he has to relinquish collection, which is why, again, we make a prusbol also Erev Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year, and we also call that Shemitah. So whether you have to relinquish collection or whether the loan itself is canceled, just to be aware, that's a big important topic. And Hashvi'is Mishmat Eses HaMilva, the chiddush of the Mishnah is that's regardless whether the loan is bishtar, is documented in a document, whether it's documented or whether it's not documented. And like we mentioned already in the intro, that this is a huge chiddush, because one would have thought that if the loan is documented, since the document places a lien on the property of the borrower, maybe we should view that as if the loan is no longer in the hand of your friend, it's already in the hand of the lender. But we don't say that, and we're going to come back to that. Now, the Mishnah will specify various debts that are not originating from a loan, and therefore they're not canceled. There's no din shmita. As an example, hakafas hachanus eina mishametes. It was very common that when people bought food from a grocery store, the way things worked, if the checkbook was with the man, and the wife and the kids went to the grocery store, so he would settle the account once a week, once a month, whenever it was done. So it was very common that when you went to the grocery store, you took food, and he made a note of how much you owe, and you didn't pay that. No, that's not called a loan, even though, again, you can say it is. It's not called a loan. You're doing a purchase. You're buying something. You just didn't pay it. Credit is not a loan, but very good. But credit can become a loan. When will the credit become a loan? Im asa a milva, but if the storekeeper rendered that credit into a loan, now it's a loan. Hadesu mishametes. And here we have a big machloikis in the Rishonim. Exactly when does that happen? According to the Rosh, it's very simple. That's a difference. Then I'll tell you, when you buy something, as long as the storekeeper did not give a date of by that date it has to be paid, then it's called a credit. But the moment, that's according to the Rosh, the moment the storekeeper, and normally he wouldn't give a date right away, whatever, this week, next week, whenever he would feel, I'm just giving it practically when it happened, that there's too much debt accumulating, he would notify the family, you have until to pay. The moment he gave a date, that already turned it into a loan. That's the Rosh. The Mordechai says, no, the Mordechai says like this, that when the storekeeper doesn't tally up, every time you went to the store to buy something, he made a note. He had a ledger, or he had a notebook, whatever he had, and he wrote, This is according to the Tanakama. We'll get to soon later. He wrote that, this family, $78. Today you buy 5 bottles of water for that over here in the kosher markets. You go to the kosher market, you pay a few $100s for a little bag, and he puts it down. But the moment he tallies up all of it, why is he adds them all up? That's because he's getting nervous. Ooh, there's too much money owed. The adding it up turns it into a loan. That's the Mordechai. And there are other opinions, however that works. However, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, I'll tell you how it works. Harishain mashmid. When he buys one purchase, very simple. When he buys one purchase, it's called a credit. It's not called a loan. The moment he buys a second purchase, psychologically, the storekeeper views the first one as a loan, because the storekeeper expects to get paid between the first purchase and the second purchase. Storekeeper never likes having 2 purchases added to his book. When he gives you the second one, he already thinks about the first one as a loan. Ooh, that money is already owed. So that's not about tallying up. That's not about the designating a date. Next example in the Mishnah of a debt that's not called a loan and therefore is not included in the din of Shemitah. Schar Sachir. You hired someone to work. They finished the job, Chavtas Elul. They finished the job before the 7th year. You didn't pay them yet. Eina Meshamit. But here also, the im aso milva. But if the worker turned that money owed into a debt, hadezu mishameit. And again, there's a big discussion of exactly how that would happen. Now, I can give you a general rule how that would happen, even though there's a lot more on this. And that is that there's an obligation in the Torah to pay your workers within the 12-hour period from when they finish the work. So if a person is a night worker, I'm talking about at the times where people paid every day. So they worked at night, they would get paid during the day. That's when now, if that day is the beginning of the 7th year, it's not mishamit. Once you delay payment, that will be one approach. And by the way, the same concept applies nowadays here in America. You don't pay people the next day. I'm not talking about a day work. I'm talking about general. You pay people, whether the payroll is once a month or twice a month, is whenever the date of payroll is. So until the date of the payroll, let's word it that way. Let's say the date of the payroll happened to be Chavtes Elul. And if you didn't pay on the payroll, now you owe the money. Now it became a debt, which is bad. Now that it became a debt, now it's mishamit. Rabbi Yossi says, Kol melacha shehi poisekas b'shvi'is, then mishametes. But einoi poisekas b'shvi'is, einoi mishametes. Let's read inside the Mahara Fulda, the end of the narrow lines. 2 lines at the end of the narrow lines, who explains what Rabbi Yossi is saying. And a lot more we will have in the Gemara. Look, let's read inside the Mahara. Kol melacha shehi poisekas b'shvi'is, which means, im schar sachir zeh, mimelacha shehi poisekas b'shvi'is, meaning, if, look at this, a whole new thing. Koloimer, the first wide line under the Gemara. If the worker was hired to do that which may not be done on Shviz. Koloimer, if someone was hired to do Charisha, to do Ketzira, to do any other Avodah Sakarka, even if it's only a Tulda, only a Midrabanan, nevertheless, but you can't do it, then Nasis, Schar Zeh, B'Shviz, Kimilva. Forget about the day when you have to
So
pay.
even if he did it in the 6th year when it was mutter?
Yes, Danny. In other words, if he did work in the 6th year, that may not be done in the 7th year. Forget about the date. Then it becomes into a loan. But the imlav, meaning that that the work for the labor that he did not yet pay comes from mishan melachos, from any other work she'ein asuras b'shvi'is. Even though the date Danny was, let's say, Chavtes Elul, and he didn't pay for it yet, which is wrong, we don't say it became a loan, loy nasa kimilva, and therefore ve'ein ashvius mishamatzoi, and we're going to get back to this in the Gemara. Mamish. Next case in the Mishnah. Hashoichet asapara v'chilka b'Rosh Hashanah. In those days, people, first of all, there was no refrigeration. The way it worked is that prior to shechting, ideally the butcher would already want to have customers for the whole cow. when it came to Yom Tov, he normally did not have that concern. The case of the Mishnah is he shechts a cow when on, let's say, I'm going to use the words, guys, on Chof Tes Elul, he gives out the meat on what he thinks is Echad B'Tishrei. When I am saying what he thinks is very relevant, because up until the times of Hillel HaKatan, even after the Churban Beis HaMikdash, for hundreds of years, we were Machadesh the Chodesh Al Pi Hariyah, and it very well could have been that everyone kept the day after Chavtas Elul as Rosh Hashanah, as Yom Tov, because Edom might come that day claiming they saw the moon last night, turning day 30 into day 1, but it could be no one saw the moon. And if when no one sees the moon, then automatically the next day, Yom Lamed Aleph becomes Yom Aleph. Now, he shechted the cow on Chavtes. He gave it out on what he thought was Rosh Hashanah. When do you owe the money? You, the buyer. You owe the money, Chevra, when you buy it, when you get the meat. You don't owe the money when did you get the meat? If you got the meat on Echad B'Tishrei, guys, let's go with the majority of opinion. Miketz Sheva Shana means that Shemitah is Meshamet at the end of the 7th year. So Chav Tes Elul at the end of the 7th year, you shechted it. You gave out the meat on what was observed as the first day of Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year. And then it turned out that it never became Rosh Hashanah. Turned out that he gave out the meat on Lamed, we don't have on the calendar, but then on Lamed Elul of the 7th year.
Why can't you just say he gave it on Chav Tes?
In other words, no Edom came on the 30th. Turned out that you actually gave out the meat when? On the last day of the 7th year. Now comes in the 8th year. Now mashmate. Now the obligation, this debt is canceled. Now, what we're going to have to deal with is that the Mishnah just said before that a storekeeper, right, who gives out money, credit is not a debt. We're going to deal with this in the Gemara. But we also learned in the Mishnah that sometimes it turns into a debt. So the question is not how did it become a debt? The question is when did it happen? So it turns out that even though they thought he gave it out because people would observe Rosh Hashanah out of doubt, might be Yom Tov. So they had Seudas Yom Tov. So they needed meat, which is why he gave it out. So what? If later we discovered that the Edom did not come, and therefore it was Daka day 30, Yom Kippur won't be the 10th day from that day, it will be 10th day from the next day. In other words, the debt, when it became a debt, it incurred at the end of the 7th year. So now mashmate.
Why do you have to give this funny example where he gave out the meat on the 30th? Why can't you say like normal? You buy it, go Erev Yom Tov to get your meat, Chav Tes, and then he thought it's for Rosh Hashanah, and then turned out that he had accepted the meat before Rosh Hashanah. Who cares whether it was the first or the second? Like, I don't see why
Danny,
you have to do it that way.
We have to still tie up this question of not always is taking credit from a vendor considered a loan. We'll have to get back to that. Here, everyone kept that day as Rosh Hashanah. I got the meat. He gave out the meat because it's Rosh Hashanah. There was a chiddush here. I can't hear you. Your mic is off.
I'm just saying. First of all, I don't even understand the case of someone giving meat on Rosh Hashanah. But even aside from that,
that's how it worked. Danny, no, stop. That's how it worked.
Why?
That's how it worked.
People say what they shechted it on Rosh Hashanah. Is that what happened?
They shechted it the day before, and they cut it up properly before, and they would deliver it on Yom Tov. And it's not uncommon ad hayom hazeh that on Yom Tov you get what you need from the store today. With all of the, we learned this. You can't count. There's certain rules about. You don't speak about it. I mean, the issue of you might of weighing, but people are now. What's common in the Chassidish world on Simchas Torah, you ran out of mashke. It's the most common thing that vendors of mashke would supply mashke, and then they'll deal with it after Yom Tov vis-a-vis settling the account. There's no issue of carrying. Anyways, let's go weiter. Other obligations that are not viewed as a loan debt. So if a person is ma'anis or mafata, without going in through all of these dinim, both the ma'anis, if a man, God forbid, raped a woman, or if he seduced a young woman, and there the penalty is to give 50 shekel kesef, or hamoitzi shemra, which he has to give 100 shekel. And v'chol ma'aseh bezdin. V'chol ma'aseh bezdin means any type of din Torah. I don't care what it came from, but it came to the point where not only was there a psak din, but it was written down. It's called a ma'aseh bezdin. So they wrote a psak din that so and so is chayiv. All of these financial obligations don't come from a loan, and therefore, even though they were not paid prior to Mikhet Sheva Shanim, doesn't matter. Eina mashmiten. They will not be canceled. Hamav ala mashkoin, we spoke this out in the introduction. Here we go. But if the lender lent money, a proper loan, but he took collateral, here, even though he doesn't want to keep the collateral, but since he has the collateral, which means that if the borrower will not repay, he already has payment, halachically, we don't view the borrower as someone who did not yet pay. He already paid. The loan is paid. It's in the hand of his fellow. The Torah says, Lo yigois es achiv. He doesn't have to approach him. He's never going to approach him. The achiv is going to the lender to redeem the mashkin. It's in the opposite direction. That's case number one. Case number two, which is the final case of the Mishnah, the last line in the Amid, if a person physically hands over his loan documents to the court, asking the court to collect on his behalf, in these cases, both of these cases, ein mashmitim, these loans will not be canceled. I quickly want to read from the beginning of Masechta Makos. I know it's getting late. Masechta Makos, Daf Gimel Amid Beis. So when the Gemara is speaking about someone who's moiser shtoros lebezdin, says Rashi, who prusbel, right? That's the concept of a prusbel. That since the Torah says you may not, you have to relinquish in the individual or in the negative. Lo yigois, you may not oppress, you may not collect. Bezdin can collect, and that's the prusbel. Just to know, the word prusbel is prus means a takana. Bule bute. That's what we had in Gittin, I think, Taflamed Vav, a enactment which is good for the wealthy and good for the poor. It's good for the wealthy because wealthy are blessed with more wealth when they lend money. Or they shouldn't violate the law that we mentioned of, don't withhold lending money. It's good for the poor because the poor need money. So it's a takana. And what's prusbel? That I'm giving over to the Beis in all of my documents. Says Tosfos and Makos Daf Gimel Amid Beis. Second Tosfos in the Amid. Hamoiser shtoros lebezdin perush bekontris dahainu prusbel. No, v'lo nida. And he quotes our Mishnah. Taha b'Masechta Shvius. Now, Perek Yud, I'm just reading Mishnah Beis. We have different seder of Mishnayos, a different way of enumerating the Mishnayos. And Tanei, in our Mishnah, we learned Hamoiser shtoros lebezdin. In the next Mishnah, we're going to learn about a prusbel. So it can be the same thing. And the Ritva, I hope we spoke it out when we learned this together, says no, it's the same, but it's not the same. Because Hamoiser shtoros lebezdin means you physically gave your documents to the Bezdin. What Hillel was misakin, and what we do by a prusbel is that even though you do not physically give over your documents to the Bezdin, we just make a declaration that my loans are given over to Bezdin. That's a bigger chiddush. We're getting more sophisticated. You don't even, we cut out a step. That's why they are different, but it's not, in other words, Rashi and Tosfos are not really arguing. The basis of a prusbel is based on the concept of this Mishnah, that if you're moister shtoros lebezdin, ei mashmitin. Okay, daf ayin tes amid beis. And like we mentioned in the intro, we're going to have one thing in the whole Amud. Let's see how far we can get. And that is, that now that we learned at the end of the Mishnah, that hamalva ala mashkein ein mashmitin. So why is it that if you make a loan and it's documented, the first case of the Mishnah writes, bein bishtar, bein shaloi bishtar. Shaloi bishtar, I get it. But bishtar, a document on the shtar is liened. How is a lien on land different than a mashkin? Don't forget, a mashkin is a metaltalin, so the lender takes it. Land you don't have to take because the land is not going anywhere. It means if I have a document that gives me right, so I'm a lender and I loaned you money, and if you default, I will take possession of your land. So I already took, it's already mine. Why don't we view it that way? Hashvius mishametes, Bishtar, ben shaloi bishtar. Fragt die Gemara, nicham, shaloi bishtar. That's exactly the mitzvah. Not to collect, or in the positive, to relinquish, to be mishamet. But bishtar, why? V'yeyose kemalva al hamashkin, and therefore v'lo yiyah mashmet. And it should not be canceled, should not be nullified. 3 answers. The first answer, what's amazing about the first answer is that Rabbi Yochanan gave an answer, but halacha l'maisa, he did not rely on his own answer. In other words, you have the right in the Beis Medrash to give forth certain svaras, but just because you yourself understand in learning a certain approach doesn't mean that you yourself should apply it halacha l'maisa. Remember, me'ingen le'ingen, when Rabbi Leib Shapiro, who's here a couple of times, but the first time he came, he fabreng with the Chevre here in Sola, and he was speaking about that Rebbe, and the Fabrengen spoke maybe more than once, that when halal is said b'tzibur, even though the Alter Rebbe paskins, that when it's said, the Alter Rebbe paskins, that because of the question whether you do make a bracha, whether you don't make a bracha, we have a certain compromise. When you daven b'yachid, talking about when you say chatzi halal, then even the yachid makes a bracha pre-post, but when you daven b'tzibur, the Baal Tefillah says it, and everyone has in mind to be yotzei, and therefore they don't make a bracha. And by a Fabrengen, the Rebbe spoke about the importance of making brachas, and the Rebbe spoke about that you should make a bracha. And then the question is, what do you do when you actually do it? So he is from the minority opinion in the Lubavitcher world that absolutely you follow the psak of the Alter Rebbe. The Rebbe in a Fabrengen is like Rabbi Yochanan in the Gemara. The Rebbe was speaking about a svara in a Fabrengen, but not everything that's spoken out in a Fabrengen, even if it's a halachic discussion, is meant to be used as a psak halacha l'maisa. And here's the story. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, answer number 1. Tiftoid must be, and let me just quickly go back. In Masechtas Bava Metzia, we have a classic machlokes Rav Meir and the Chachamim. Rav Meir is the one that holds that for a documented loan to place a lien on property, you have to write that into the document. If you don't write in a document that this loan will encumber property, it's not connected to the property. The Chachamim, you have the words achrayis to'u sofer, which means that the word achrayis means that the lien automatically the loan is liened. So the land is basically taking achrayis for the loan. The Chachamim say that you don't have to write it. Any document automatically places a lien. Ad kedei kach, that writing that this is a loan that will create an achrayis is superfluous, so it's a mistake of the scribe. He didn't have to write it. Rav Meir holds no. Rav Meir holds that for it to encumber the land, it has to be written in the document. And therefore, says Rabbi Yochanan, our Mishnah follows Rav Meir. And when the Mishnah says that even if the loan was documented, shvius will be mishamed, b'tiftoir b'shtar she'ei b'yachrayis nechasim. It's a type of loan where nothing regarding a lien was written in. Ucherav Meir. Okay. Says the Gemara, also uvda kamei Rabbi Yochanan. What happened was that there was a loan that was bishtar. Now here it's key, important to go not with the word she'ein, like the Marafulda writes clearly, sheyesh boyachrayis nechasim, because according to Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation, even according to Rav Meir, not only according to Rav Meir, if you write in the document that the lands are liened, then shvius is not neshamet, right? Then the lender could collect the money because really he already collected it. When that happened, b'shtar sheyesh boyachrayis nechasim. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yochanan paskin that you cannot collect a loan. Mashmeit. And Rabbi Yochanan was aware of the irony, because when he explained our Mishnah, right, he said the opposite. So Rabbi Yochanan said on himself, Amar, that mipnei she'anu lemeidim in halacha anu eisen eisai. Just because halacha here means the Mishnah, just because I learned pshat in a Mishnah in a certain way, which was based on svara, does that mean that when it comes to halacha l'maisa, this is what we will follow? Not necessarily so. When in the Beis Medrash, I can learn one way, but when it comes to halacha l'maisa, the Rabbi Yochanan was not of the opinion that you should actually limit the Mishnah. Fakir, the Mishnah writes bishtar, regardless. Ubefrat, that we paskin like the Chachamim that Achrai is his toes. I mean, every shtar a place is a lien, and the Mishnah says that doesn't make a difference. The loan has to be cancelled. But now we're back to the question. Was Rabbi Yochanan himself rejected his answer? So now for sure you need to have another explanation. Again, what's the kasha? Hamalve al hamashkoin ein mashmitin. So why hamalve b'shtar? Yes, mashmit. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, answer number 2. This is a simple answer. You know when a documented loan won't be mishamet, b'she'ein lo karka, only if the lender has no land. Now, guys, remember again that unless specified, a lien is connected to real estate. Lien is not connected to metaltalin. No one, right? When a bank now lends money, the metaltalin is really useless to the bank. Because by the time you default, you might not have the metaltalin. The only thing that is secure is land. Says the Gemara, in other words, when Rabbi Yirmiyah learned that pshat in the Mishnah, that implies, indeed, ha'im yesh le karka, that if the debtor has land, then yes, it will be what? Einoi mashmeit. Now let me just speak in words of a chiddush. And there's a chiddush to that. So let me introduce the following. That when a person has land, even when the land is liened, there are 2 types of liens. Without an apoitike, with an apoitike. You're not miyachet karka, you are miyachet karka. Meaning, people over here, Baruch Hashem, have various properties. And let's say a person has 3 properties. Each property is worth $1 million. And they take a loan of $1 million. If they're not miyachet karka, then what? Then all of the lands are liened to it. Whichever one the lender wants. When you are miyachet karka, on one hand, you can argue you're limiting the ability of the lender to collect. On the other hand, when you designate land, either miyachid karka, or in the times of the Gemara, they called it an apoitike, apoitehekoi, it's from here that you will collect. You can argue that a apoitike is more like a mashkin, because it's something specific to this loan. The lender already knows which house he'll go into. It's a lien on a specific land. So when the Gemara says over here, im yesh le karka eina mashmat, the Gemara is not saying what's obvious. The Gemara is saying what's not obvious. That we are inferring from Rabbi Yirmiyah that if the lender has land, even if you were not miyachet karka, even though you didn't make an apoitike, doesn't make a difference. Fact that he has land, that becomes like a mashkin. Now the mashkin is the ultimate apoitike. I'll tell you why, because a mashkin is given to the lender. It's not just a poiteka. He has already something. When you're miyachet karka, that's avada like a mashkin. What we are inferring from Rabbi Yirmiyah, that whether he was miyachet karka or not, a lien is enough for us to say that the lender already collected, whichever one he'll collect later. Yesh Bereda, he'll collect the one on the right. Retroactively, that was always his, so to say. And therefore, there's no issue with shviz. There's no shmita because he doesn't have to relinquish. He already collected. And now the third approach, Amar Rabbi Yosei. No, why are you, Rabbi Yirmiyah, limiting the Mishnah so much? I'll tell you better. That afilu yesh le karka mashmeit. That's very important. In other words, the fact that the Mishnah did not say that when you're malva al ashtar, it depends whether you have land or not. Mashma, that even if you have land, shvius won't be mishamit. Now the question is, why not? That was the question. If you have land and the land is liened, let's go with the Chachamim Achrayis to Sofer, or let's go with Rav Meir and you wrote land. So why is shvius going to go into effect? That's the answer. The answer is because you were not miyachet karka. A mashkin means it's collected because the lender has that specific item. The borrower is going to buy it back, so to say, with the value of the loan. even when there is a lien, if you were not miyachid karka, so which land belongs to the lender? We don't know. So he has to designate that. Afili yesh le karka mashmeit, and asya the Rabbi Yosi kederav. And now, see now you'll chap. This fits with that which Rav said to Amar Rabbi Ba in the name of Rav, that only when yichoid le karka, then we have to go with the words einoi mashmeit. That's already that you take a right, because yichoid le karka, get land you don't put in your pocket. Land is where it is. No one puts it in their pocket. Land has us in its pocket. But when you are miyachid land, that's taka mashkin. Because there's nothing that the lender has to do to clarify what's his. He already know which land this is. When did Rav say yichud lekarka eine mashmet? Lo yomru elo yiched loy, only because it was designated. So it's not about yes lien or not lien. No, it's whether there is an apoitika or whether there's no apoitika. Ha-im lo yichad, but if he did not designate a specific land, even though he has lands to cover it, then indeed we're going to go with the girsa mashmeit, and that's the meaning of our Mishnah. The Mishnah is the best now. You're not limiting the Mishnah like Rav Meir. You're not limiting the Mishnah when he has no land. No, you have to limit the Mishnah. In other words, the kasha can only be resolved is that indeed there is a certain type of loan that's like a mashkin. What type of loan that's lien? There's a certain type of lien that's a mashka, a lien that's connected to a specific land. Gavaldik. And now let's go as far as we can go. So Hameshabed, Sadala Ishtoim. So one of the chiyuvim that a man has when he gets married is the ksuba money. And if he this is being miyached a land, an apoitika. He wrote in the ksuba which land will the right use to collect her ksuba debt for hol, and the man went in his marriage and he sold that land. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that the wife can only collect it from that land, meaning she'll have to go to the purchaser and get it? Or even when a man is miyached karka, let's go with ksuba, it doesn't mean, I know there's no lender, the wife is not a lender, but the wife is the person, she's the creditor, that she has an option to do whatever is better for her. That's the chiddush over here, says the Braisa. If she wants to collect it from that land, which is currently biyad l'kuchais with the headache, she can do that because it's in her ksuba. He was miyachid karka. But if she doesn't want to collect it from that, if she wants to collect it from a b'nei choyrin that's in the possession of the heirs, or that's the vavis and or either or, mishar nechasim, she can be goiva. No, it's even though the husband made an apoitika is only to the benefit of the creditor. It's never to their detriment. Amar Afila. First of all, even Rabbi Lazar Paskin Kohan Tanya, like this Braisa. Says the Gemara, Chavraya Bayon Loy Sigba Ela Menachasim Mishubadim. 1 second. If he designated a specific land, why wouldn't we say, well, on one hand, it's great, you know what you're collecting from, but it should only be from that? Amalon Rabbi Yosi. No, doesn't make sense to do that. Why not? Because even an apoitika doesn't mean it's mamish hers. It means that she knows what she'll collect it from. But if it's easier for her to collect from the Bnei Choyden, what are we going to say? Bnei Choyden lefoneha ba'at omrat mishubadim? Then we're not going to go out kedekach. Bnei Choyden means lands that were not sold. Now says the Gemara, and we have to go into the end of the Amid, we have another minute. This nuance of saying that even when there is a apoitika, it doesn't limit the creditor to only take it. It depends on what type of apoitika. Get these words. There are two types of an apoitika. There is an apoitika mefoidesh. An apoitika mefoidesh is when you write in the document, listen to the words, that you will not get paid only from this. Loy ella. When you say a loy ella, then the creditor can only collect from that property. An apoitika that's called stam, even though you're meyachid karka, if you don't add to that you will not be able to collect only from this, Even though you designate a land, it's like the Braisa writes, it gives the creditor more options. If they want to collect from this land, they can collect it even from the Mishubadim, even though there's B'nai Chayrim. But if they want, they can collect it from the B'nai Chayrim. We're going to read it inside. It says the Gemara, this Braisa, the Braisa that says that the woman is allowed to collect it, not from the apoitika, even though there was an apoitika. That's only b'shaloi amala, when he did not make it into a apoitika mefoirish, which would mean he did not write in the ksuba lo yehei loch peiroyon ela mizeh. Then look inside the last pin. Moshe, we'll stop over here. The hoyel va'asa apoitika mefoirish. And she has to be moitzia hasad mi'al lekeyach. Ve'ena yochel salka b'damim.